have got it. And I am a member of the University Writing Center. I'm an assistant coordinator, and I assist the main coordinator, Monique Bain, and I have been working at the center for about 5 years. From time to time, we put on different workshops that can help assist students with their writing, with also understanding certain composition conventions or even formatting conventions and so forth. So this is something that we're familiar with, we've done in the past, and we'll continue to do in the future as long as there's a particular need. So today we're going to be presenting on MLA. And if you are on the Zoom, it's most likely because perhaps you've encountered this particular style guide or perhaps other style guides, and you want to get some more information about it. You want to perhaps understand it a bit more. Perhaps a professor directed you here. I'm not sure, but whatever the intent, hopefully this particular presentation can really bring some more insight and some clarity on the style guide. And a lot of students who've actually implemented and adopted style guides, I believe that they experience a bit of hesitation or apprehension with style guides because it's so mechanical, and style guides can be so loaded with information and know-hows, again, in terms of fundamentals and mechanics. But really, there really is an easier approach to style guides. You just have to sort of work through the myth of it being difficult. And so again, this presentation aims to demystify some of that in terms of the level of difficulty subscribing to a particular style guide, in this case, MLA, okay? So let's get started. So MLA formatting and style guide. So this presentation will cover general formatting, InText Citations, and also the works cited page. And if you guys look at the photo, we are dealing with the 9th edition for MLA. MLA was recently updated last year. And so some of your professors might have already started to ask you to use the 9th edition. Some might actually decide to stick with the 8th edition for now. You really want to hear what your professor's saying in that regard. But in terms of moving forward, MLA has officially updated to the 9th edition, okay? At some point, we will cover some of those updates. And let me warn you, there aren't that many, which is a good thing, because if you've already become familiar with the fundamentals of MLA, then this is definitely just a polish for you, okay? Okay. So what is MLA? MLA stands for Modern Language Association. And so that's an association made up of academics, researchers, and qualified professionals who've come together to create I guess you could say, a series or a contract of conventions on how research information or formal information should be presented in their field. So they've come together, created this style guide, again, for our persons to use in their fields, in academia, in colleges and universities. And so depending on this, again, the style guide chosen within a particular area, you would need to be quite aware of those conventions. Okay. It's also a documentation style used to cite research or reference sources. So the thing I tell students is that citing sources is really, or referencing sources is a part of life, because persons have had many informal conversations where maybe they told a friend, hey, my dad said this, or my mother said this, or Tupac Shakur said this. or I heard this from the Steve Harvey show, et cetera, et cetera. So whether you are privy to it or not, we've already been citing or referencing sources. And now what you're doing in academia is presenting those references in a very formal way. So you would need to document that in a particular style guide, and in this case, of course, MLA. Also, what should be known with MLA, this style guide is often associated with the humanities and liberal arts, especially for language and literature. If you had other courses, perhaps in the sciences, they would have proposed other style guides. APA is another common style guide, very, very popular. But again, you would need to figure out what style guide you would need to be working with and learn the conventions of that style guide. Okay, so here's the thing. Many students hate the process of citations or making references to sources, but there's definitely a purpose behind it. So let's go through some of those reasons. Okay, so one of the main reasons you would need to cite a source or reference a source is to show that you've done your homework. If you're writing a research paper, most likely you're reading other source material on a particular topic. And the strength of a research paper is to be able to argue, of course, your main ideas, but also ground your main ideas in research. So you would be doing a lot of reading, in some cases, even watching certain textual material and so forth, like visual text. And you would need to definitely point to those sources and provide where you found that information. So you definitely want to show that you've done your homework. You also want to give credit to someone else's intellectual property. On the flip side of that, if you don't, that's called plagiarism, which is actually an academic offense. So in fact, depending on your college policies or university policies, students can get in real trouble if they do not cite their sources efficiently. Okay, so you want to avoid plagiarism and actually give credit where credit's due. When you use citations, you also guide readers to explore the research that you've done. So let's say you wrote a paper on the benefits or the advantages of marijuana, and someone who, let's say they're deciding to open up a cannabis store, or let's say they're an academic and they want to find out more information about it, and they read your paper and they want more information, they can go to your sources and see what sources you use, what type of information was presented as it related to the sources and so forth. Okay, well, I already spoke to plagiarism, but you definitely have to use your citations to avoid plagiarism. That's just standard information, all right? So moving on, we're going to look at just basic formatting for MLA. And when I say basic, this is something that should carry over into everything that you do, because there's more specific formatting that will depend on the type of source you're looking at. But in terms of basic, this will translate into everyone's essay or paper. So some of those formatting guidelines include having a paper that's 8.5 by 11 inch, which is pretty standard if you're working in Word or any other sort of document application. Your essay also needs to be double spaced. I've seen essays, research essays submitted single space, and anytime I see that, I think that the student have missed the memo, because what's standard is to double space that information. Okay, your font also needs to be 12 point. You need 1 inch margins on all sides. 1 inch margins are somewhat of the default, especially if you're working in Word, but you can always go to the margins tab and make sure or ensure that they're set to 1 inch. With MLA, you also need to include page numbers, and page numbers will also be present on that first page. You also will be using or formatting indents or indentations. So you want to make sure that it's set to a 1/2 inch. Okay. You also want to use easy read fonts. In this case, Times New Roman is pretty classic, so you can't go wrong there. So just if you want to plan, simply just use Times New Roman. I believe some other professors, they allow for different fonts, but Times New Roman is the most popular font used, okay? And then you also want a single space after periods. Now, this may seem very minute, but some students, let's say they had a computer class where their teacher taught them to do a double space after periods. You know, no one knows what type of background a person is coming from when they're formatting. So you would need to definitely look at the things that are expected and make some adjustments if for some reason you have a different background in terms of formatting. All right, let's move on. So we're going to look at specific guidelines for the first page, and then I have a few images of that first page so that we can go through that. But here are some things to note. On the first page for MLA, in the upper left-hand corner, you're going to have the title page. Sorry, for the titling, you're gonna have your name, your instructor's name. So let's say you're in English 300, and your instructor is Dr. Craig Smith. So you'll have your name and then Dr. Craig Smith, and then the course, which would be English 300 if that's the course you're taking, and then the date, okay? The date comes in a specific order, which I'll show you on the example, but those are the 4 elements for the titling on your first page. In the upper right-hand corner, you're going to have what's called a header. And that header is going to include your last name, you, the writer of the paper, and then the page number. So for the first page, it's going to be definitely page 1, because that's where it starts. But that header, you will allow to run through the entire essay. And so, of course, your name, your last name will remain the same, but those page numbers will change as, of course, you lengthen the paper and move on to different pages. MLA for the first page, there's also a paper title. So you would need to give your paper a title. It can't be untitled unless your professor specifically says, you know, it's okay to not have a title, but what's standard is to have a title. So your title will be use standard caps or title case, which means the first letter in all the words will be capitalized, except if they're articles, okay? No bold. I know APA uses bold, but from MLA, there's no bold and there's no italics. So let's look at an example. So this is what the first or the top of the first page of an MLA paper looks like. So if you look to your left, you see the name of the student, the first and last name. If you use an initial, that's fine. There's also the name of the professor of the class. There's the title of the course, and then there's the date. If you look at the date, the day, the number of the day is first, and then the month, which is spelled out, and then the year. So you can order it or format in that order, okay? And then if you look in the far right corner, you'll see the running head, the last name of the student, which is Josephson, and then also the page number. And then you have your title in the middle, which is Ellington's Adventures in Music and Geography. And if you look at some of the numbers on the page and the lines, you see that there's 1 inch margins. The running head is half of an inch, but when you actually put in the running head, because application like Word will allow you to put in certain running heads, that format most likely is usually set at ½ inch. So there's not much tinkering you would have to do in terms of setting those specific numbers. But if you look at how the paragraph starts, the first paragraphs, there's an indent. So you always want to make sure you're indenting, especially when you're starting those paragraphs, okay? Any questions at this point? Okay.
For the, like how you said, for example, if the teacher was Craig Smith, you just put Professor Smith or Professor Craig instead of his full name.
I would put the full name. I feel like a full name is more formal. So you can use the full name. Okay. All right. There's no one else. Let's move on. Or the actual essay, okay? All right, so in-text citations for MLA gives readers two kinds of information. The first is which source, and that's typically associated with the last name of the source of whoever the author is. In some cases, your source may not have an author. So with MLA, it allows you to use the title, okay? So the title of the work. If it's a long title, MLA allows you to abbreviate that title, but we can look at some examples of how a title shows up in terms of the in-text citation. So you want to first have which source, which shows the author. And then you also want to include where the source was found. In this case, page numbers. Now, some sources may not have page numbers. They may have paragraph numbers, section numbers, line numbers, etc. So there are ways to format those things specifically. And you can always make reference to those type of sources in the particular MLA guides, but we will actually see some of them here in this presentation, okay? So again, you would name the name and the locator in your in-text citation. And an example, let's say the author of a book that you reference, his name is Author Smith. We're going to use his last name, Smith. And let's say you use information that was found on page 9. You're going to put that page 9 there. And if you look at it, it's just a round parentheses. There's no comma, no other punctuation within the in-text citation, just the name and the page number. Now, here's the thing, and we can touch on those details a little bit later. This is the most common presentation of an in-text citation. So most of your in-text citations may look like this, okay? Now, if you're sourcing or referencing material that's outside of prose, let's say poetry or plays and so forth, it may have more material in it or more elements. So there may be perhaps lines, the word lines, or sections, paragraphs, it depends. You may even have semicolons used, but certain elements really suggest certain things. For example, if you are referencing a source that has more than one author and you used, let's say, 2 different authors' information in the same sentence, then you can cite that source, whereas you have the author's name, the page number, and then you have this semicolon, then the second author's name and the page number. So what I'm saying is that there are different ways to present an in-text citation depending on the type of information given. But in terms of what's standard, you're most likely going to simply have the last name and the page number, okay? Okay, so there are a few know-hows for in-text citations. Again, you're going to be presenting 2 kinds of information. which source and where, in this case, the name and the locator. So just in terms of the name, be aware that that last name is spelled out. There's no abbreviation. For the in-text, you can list up to 2 authors' names, and I'll show you some examples of those a little bit later. If you're using more than 2 authors or listing it for the in-text, you would need to simply list the first author and then use et al. And students probably have seen that abbreviation, but et al. Simply means others, meaning there's more than one, okay? And for the locator, you'll typically have the page number, but in some cases, a line number will be available versus a page number, section number, a paragraph number, and a timestamp. It depends. Let's say you're watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and this is a TV show. I mean, that's not going to have a page number or line number, but you can present a timestamp, which will include the hour, the minute, and the second. Okay, so that's just an example. If there is no locator on your source, then you don't have to put anything in that particular parentheses. You simply include, in terms of the locator, you simply include the last name, okay? Because there are some sources where there's no locator, so there's no numerical information and so forth. Okay. All right, and I'll open it up for questions in a few. So there are 2 types of in-text citations, and I've seen students submit, perhaps, let's say they've mastered one type of in-text citation and neglected the other. So when you're writing your essays, you want to balance the 2. You want to be able to present the 2 ways. Well, because one, it helps your paper appear less monotonous or seemingly visually, I guess, redundant in a way. So it helps to make it more dynamic. Okay, and then 2, it shows that you are capable of citing in different ways. So one of the first ways to present an in-text citation is by using a narrative or prose citation. So what that means is that the part of a sentence. In other words, you've used a signal phrase, and a signal phrase simply means that you've signified what an author is saying or what they proposed or what they argued or presented, and you're including that name in that particular sentence, that phrase, the name in a phrase attached to the sentence. So an example here, I'll read it. When it comes to technology, King states that we need to be comfortable enough with technology tools and services that we can help point our patrons in the right direction, even if we aren't intimately familiar with how the device works. So the in-text citation, the narrative citation, go back, is King, who is the author, states. So, well, I should say this, the signal phrase is King states, but King is the author that's a part of the actual sentence. But let's say that this is coming from a book. 11 at the end of the direct quotation represents the page number, okay? So you have the author separate from the page number because the author's name is a part of the sentence. It's a narrative or prose citation, and the page number is at the end, okay? You always want that page number at the end of the quotation or the paraphrase. The next type of in-text citation is a parenthetical. What that means is all your references or citations are within the parentheses. So using the same author is the same quote, right? It's a direct quote in this case. But King, when it comes to technology, blank, blank, blank. And then you see his last name in the parentheses at the end with the page number. Lachey, I think you have your hand up. I can take a question.
I just wanted to, you noted that when there's no source reference, like page number, you don't have to include it, but what about like websites that don't include the author's name either? What do you do in that case?
When there's no author?
Yes.
For MLA, you can include the title, which I said it before, but the title should be abbreviated, but not abbreviated in a way where we don't understand what the source is, because some persons may chop it up too much. So you want to have, a fair abbreviation, okay? But we'll see some examples pretty soon, okay? All right. This slide we can get into. We don't have to belabor over it because students should be familiar with direct quotations versus paraphrasing, but I'll just get into it just very quickly. So direct quotation is when you're quoting something word for word, and it's usually signaled with the pair of quotation marks, okay? And when you're using a direct quotation, you definitely are including the page number, right? Some style guides actually, they have some leeway in terms of using a locator, meaning a page number and so forth. But with MLA, you always want to present your page number right after the direct quotation. And there's also paraphrasing when you're not quoting word for word, but actually rephrasing a sentence or a few lines or even a paragraph. In the case of MLA, even if you're paraphrasing, you still need to present your page number. I know with APA, if you're paraphrasing, you don't have to present the page numbers or any identifier. But again, in the case of MLA, you have to present that author as well as the locator, in this case, the page number. Okay. Another rule with InText citations, there's a difference between short and long quotations. Sometimes students maybe just want to use a line or two of information, and so that can be considered a short quotation. Sometimes they want to use a whole chunk of information just because it's vital to what it is they want to say. So we're going to get into how you format it for MLA. So in MLA, a short quotation is considered lines that are less than 5 lines, I should say. So if it's more than 4 lines, it's going to be a long quotation. If it's 4 lines or less, it's a short quotation. So once your line is 4 lines or less, it's a short quotation, and you can format it within the sentence. It doesn't need any extra adjustment. So you can just go ahead and format, right? Now let's look at a long quotation. This formatting is a bit different. So in terms of prose, if it's more than 4 lines, so if it's 5 lines and higher in MLA, then that's considered a long quotation. So if you are using a long quotation, you have to do a few things differently. One of the first things is indentation. So even let's say you're indenting at the start of a paragraph, you understand that type of indentation. However, when you're using a long quotation, you also must employ indentation. It doesn't matter if it's at the start of a paragraph or not, because usually there's some context there, so it's never really at the start. But with the long quotation, every line has to be indented, okay? So it looks differently on the page. And if you look at it, your period comes before the parentheses. So in the other types of general citations, the period comes after the parentheses. But in the long quotation, it comes right before, okay? Any questions on that? Okay. So let me make a note, because many students, they come from different backgrounds, and some are actually taking English courses. And in those courses, maybe they're getting into poetry, plays, so forth. Now, plays and fiction stories, that can be considered prose. But poetry is a different genre, it's a different type. And so poetry is not necessarily considered prose. So for poetry, you must include a block quote or what's considered a long quotation if there's a line that's 3 lines or more, okay? So 3 or more lines is considered a long quotation in poetry. All right, so there's an exception for poetry, but aside from that, when you're dealing with prose, it's that 5 lines or more that's considered a block quote or long quotation, needing to be formatted as a block quote. Okay. All right, just a few more details with InText citations. There are times where students may want to add words or omit words just so that things can fit within the sentence that they're writing or in the message that they're telling. So there are a few rules on adding and omitting words in citations. So just so you know that you can do it, you just need to follow certain guidelines. So one of the first things, if you add a word or words in a quotation, you should put square brackets around it. So in this particular quote, and I'll read it, Jan Harold Brunvand, in an essay on urban legends, states, some individuals who retell urban legends make a point of learning every rumor or tale. End of sentence. So there's a portion or phrase that uses square brackets, and that phrase is who retell urban legends. What that means is that is not the direct words from Jan Harold Brunvand. That's actually an insertion from the author, and you can consider yourself the author or writer of the paper. And that's the writer of the paper's own words. So they set that apart from the rest of the quote by putting square brackets around it. So anytime you want to add a phrase or word, put the square brackets around it, okay? All right. On the other end of things, if you're omitting a word from a quotation, you should indicate the deleted word by using ellipses, marks, preceded and followed by a space. So if you're taking out some words, you need to use the ellipses, which is the triple periods or the triple dots, and that lets readers know that words are missing. And so it's all that to say, it's okay to tinker with the citations if need be. In this case, the direct quotations, right? You can add or you can omit or take out, okay? Okay. All right, so I'm going to show you guys some examples of InText citations. Let's get into it. So for InText citations for a print source with a known author, this is one of the most common. You'll see that the sentence has the citation with the author's name, Kenneth Burke, but in this case, Burke is the only thing that we really need in terms of detail, then the page number 3. You also, and that's a prose or narrative citation. The next one is a parenthetical where all the information is in the parentheses. Okay, so Burke and then the page number. Now for citations with no known author, this is where you will use a title or a shortened title, depending if the title is too long. So for the next sentence or source, no author is known. And so the title of the piece, Impact of Global Warming, and it's set off in quotation marks. And there's the locator, which is page 6, okay? So that suffices when there's not an author who's known, okay? Okay, so sometimes in your research, you may find that you're using 2 authors that have the same last name. Now, remember, for the InText citation, you only need the last name and the page number. However, if there are 2 authors with the same last name, that is the only time you're allowed to bring in the abbreviated first name. So you can use the initial. In this case, there's an R. Miller, and then there's a Miller, okay? And then when you're using narrative or prose citation, you want to spell out the full name. So you see a signal phrase here, according to Renard Miller and Anthony Miller, blank, blank, blank. So you want to spell out the full name for the prose or narrative citation. Okay, so you may have a citation that uses two authors, like a source that has two authors. So let's say two authors authored a book. And in this case, the author's names are Best and Marcus, that being the last name. You would present the last names. It's fully spelled out in the narrative as well as the parenthetical citation. So if you look way at the bottom at the parenthetical citation, meaning the citation that's completely in parentheses, you'll see that best and, meaning the article and, is used. Don't use an ampersand, like the symbol of and. You want to spell out the word and, and then you see Marcus, the last name, and then the page number. Okay. So going back to what was presented earlier, you will sometimes have sources that have more than two authors. So when it's more than two, that's when you start to incorporate the phrase or the abbreviation et al., which means there are others. So in this case, let's say the first author listed is Frank, but there's so many other authors. Let's say there's 5 more authors that authored this one book. In this case, you don't list all the authors, you simply put Frank et al., okay? Moving down, you also can list an organization as the author, because if there's no given name and it's a whole organization, let's say that published something or authored something, that's also something that you can do. So you can include the name of the organization, which would function as the author. In this case, the Twain Society. And then you can put the page number along with that particular organization. Okay. All right. So sometimes students will come across in their research an author who has cited another author in their source. So let's say you're reading Smith's book, and in his book he quotes an author, Meredith, right? So in Smith's book he might say, well, Meredith refers to blank, 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 or Meredith states, or Meredith proposes. So you would need to show that the source you're using was quoting another source, and that's called an indirect source. So in this case, you would use the abbreviated QTD period and then in, so quoted in, okay, but make sure it's abbreviated. And the quoted in, when you're putting that in the parenthetical citation, you're actually putting Smith, the source, the source that you're looking into. And then if you notice, the secondary source is used in the narrative or actual sentence, okay? Okay, I can take some questions at this point. And if you have a question.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
With interviews, how would you, do you need to have an InText citation for interviews?
No, but you will need to identify who stated what. So interviews fall under personal communication. So usually all the elements of that particular reference are more seen in the work cited. And I can look into that for you, Lachey, and probably send you an example. Okay, most likely I'll follow up with this presentation and email this PowerPoint out, and then include some more examples, okay?
Okay.
Ioka?
Just a question for the, I think the last point when we quoting someone in another text. So we put quoted in, do we put the main, like the larger book or the actual article in that book?
You put the source that you found it in. You found it. So let's say again, you're reading a book by Smith and Smith quoted Meredith. You're putting Smith in that parenthesis. Okay.
Oh, okay. So I think I misinterpreted it. So
Okay.
what I understand that. Thank you. But if
Okay.
it's like a compilation, like a journal, right? And it's about 6 different articles in it. What happens then? Do we quote?
Well, it depends, because if they're not using a direct quote from the 6 different journals, then I wouldn't bother making mention of it. Are you referring to when they're using a direct quote of 6 different journals?
No, it's just like it's one journal, right? But then it has 6 articles in it, and you only quote in one article.
Well, again, that depends on what you put on paper. So if you're only highlighting a particular phrase or a direct quotation, then simply use the information for whoever quoted that direct phrase, okay? Because you're gonna have whatever source you read, they're going to be informed by multiple sources. You see what I mean? So their paper, essay, or book is informed by multiple sources, but in terms of the specific quote that you drew attention to in your paper, you would need to attach that to the specific author that they quoted. In most cases, it's not going to be 6. And if it's 6, then it comes up as at all. If 6 persons are responsible for one quote, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Okay. I think someone else had their hand up.
Yes. I was wondering, how do you cite a survey that you conducted yourself? Is that similar to how you would cite an interview that you did?
I would put survey under personal communication, but surveys will have specific ways to cite it. Now, what I could do is actually look up the specific ways and then present that information to you guys after the presentation, because first of all, again, with the InText citation, you need to have the author and the identifier. So if your survey per se doesn't have the author or identifier, you can't necessarily say survey. Now, in the survey's case, now I would need to check. You may be able to use the title of the survey, but you won't necessarily have an identifier locator. Okay, so certain things you would need to be more cautious with, because it's not giving particular information. So MLA, especially in the 9th edition, they wrote an extensive guide on how to address and tackle more unique information. Okay, so survey is something that I would say pull back on. We would need to check to see if the survey has been authored. Now, you said survey that you did, but in most cases, it depends on how formal it is, because if it hasn't been published, then I wouldn't necessarily reference it. But what you're saying is a part of maybe your methodology in terms of compiling your study, and so how you want to present that. To me, that's something to look into. Okay, since it's not a published work per se, but it's more a part of the process that you used. What I will say is I've seen papers where persons reference in this particular survey, so putting that in the prose, but not necessarily having it be standard in-text citation, since there will be some information missing, okay? But I can look into that and get more specifics for you. Anyone else? Okay. All right, so we've dealt with the in-text citations. Let's move on to the works cited page. And I will point this out. APA, because I've also taught APA uses the word references. MLA uses works cited, and that's that last page where you see all the sources listed in full with all the different elements. All right, so let's go through works cited page basics, and this is just formatting. So similarly, and it's going to still be in line with some of the things we talked about earlier. You're going to maintain your 1-inch margins for this page. You're also going to have your last name, and the page number is going to be in the header. In the center, you're going to title this works cited page. You're going to put works cited at the top of the page. You're going to double space all citations. I've seen citations be presented in single space. If it's single space, it's incorrect. You need to double space it. You also need to ensure that you're not skipping or paragraphing between entries. You also want to indent the second subsequent line of a citation. Those are called hanging indents, and I'll show an image of those hanging indents. You also want to list authors' names in alphabetical order. You also want to alphabetize works with no known author by their title. So what that means is that for the most part, you're going to have these last names listed for the works cited. In some cases, you don't have an author for a particular source, and so you're going to use the title. That title will also have to be alphabetized, okay?
It's the bad habit, a really, really bad habit.
So someone's mic is on. If you could just turn it off for me, please. Okay.
I just said.
Students, just 1 second. Let me see whose mic is on. Okay. I think they turned it off. All right, so if you're also another thing to note, if you're citing more than one work by a particular author, use 3 hyphens. And I'll show you an example of that. So if you have, let's say you used a number of works by the source Smith or John, you can use 3 hyphens to show the works, aside from the first one listed, to show the subsequent works of that same author. All right, so this is an example of a works cited page. And if you look at it, there are arrows pointing to the 1-inch margins. There's also the header, which is the last name of the student or writer of the essay, and the page number in the top right hand. The title works cited in the middle. And then if you look at the entries, it's alphabetized. So starting with A and then going way down to R. And then if you look at the first entry, Alcott, Louisa May, there are 3 hyphens. And that just represents that it's from the same author, Alcott, but these are different books written by this particular author, okay? Also, if you go down, there is a movie, Black Panther, and that movie is the title of a piece. We didn't put the director because the director directed versus authored, but the title is alphabetized, okay? So it's in sequence or in the right sequence as the title. All right, I think there's another example of a works cited, okay. In this particular example, it's the same thing. We have works cited in the middle, the title. We also have the header to the top right, those 3. And then if you look at it, the first entry, blank here, Margot. And I didn't mention it previously, but the first entry is the blank here, the name starts at the margin, but then the subsequent lines are indented. So they're presented as hanging indents, okay? And I gave another example. Now this one is not the updated 9th edition, so don't look at the details just yet. I simply want to show you an example of a source that's alphabetized, but the way it's alphabetized can be questionable. And so let's go through. So I'm going to go down, not the first entry, but it's the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 entry. With that entry, there's a title. And the title is The Liberal Arts in the Age of Infodlect. Now, here's the thing. You would think that the T shouldn't come before the O, the next entry, which is O'Brien Tom. But in MLA, the articles, the, and, a, they're not counted. So technically, you're alphabetizing based on the second word in this title, which is liberal. Okay? So H, L, then O in terms of the alphabetical order. All right, so we're going to look at some core elements of the works cited, aside from the general format, which I just went over. So core elements are quite a few in number. So those elements include the author that you're listing, the title of the source, the title of the container, the contributor, the version, the number. Let's say it has more than one volume, the publisher, the publication date, location, and the date access. I will say that you typically won't have to look for a date access. Date access normally apply to websites. And the reason that's in there is because websites can be updated and content may change. So let's say you actually cited a source from a website last year, and you go to that same website and that the paragraph that you reworded or paraphrased and cited isn't there anymore. That's because it's changed. So date access would speak to when you actually retrieve that information. But again, not something to concern yourself too much in MLA. There are times that it calls for it, probably especially with blogs and so forth, but for more of the standard sources that you'll be using, there will be permalinks, meaning more permanent links and URLs and so forth, okay? So very quickly, we'll look at some of the elements, and let me make a note, because when you're citing your references on the works cited page, your source may not have all those particular elements, and so you only have certain elements, maybe 5 out of the 9 to work with and so forth. So you would just need to cite what's available. But in this example, which is highlighted, you'll see some of the different elements. In this case, the author's name is here, Baron, Naomi S. The title is here, Redefining Reading, the Impact of Digital Communication Media. You also have the container. In this case, it's a journal container. You have the version / contributor, the volume, the issue number, which is number 1, the publication date, and you also have the location, okay, the print source. Now, the container, this is a journal within a larger piece that relates to where this source is found. It's providing a URL or a web link. So that's the location, okay? All right, so we're gonna go through a few works cited entries and then we'll take some questions. But what I will say, when you guys get into listing your information on the works cited page, always have a guide or a style, well, I should say a style guide to reference, because sometimes you may have a unique source, that has a variation of something, and you need to be sure exactly how to present that source. And the 9th edition actually have updated to include so much more examples of the different types of work, that it should, for the most part, cover everything. So let's say you're citing from a blog, citing from Twitter, citing from a journal that's found online, or citing from something that's found on someone's website. Depending on the source, the style guide should have those examples available so you can always revert to, okay, to make sure everything is lined up. All right, so we're just going to go through a few of these examples of the citations. In this case, we'll look at the book. So in the case of the book, there are a few elements from what we saw previously that we can name. Like I said, not everything can be listed because some sources don't have everything, and that's okay. So with the book, you have the last name, the first name, the title of the book, the publisher, publication date. There's a book with a single author, the Glick James. So you have the name, comma, James, period. You have the book title, and if you notice, the book is italicized. That's because larger works or containers like books or anthologies, they're italicized. Shorter works are not. Shorter works can include journal articles, so titles of the article, short stories, anything that's shorter. They're considered a shorter work and use actually quotation marks. And then you have the publisher of this particular book, Penguin Press, so it will be Penguin, comma, and the year it was published or released. So there's also an example of books by 2 or more authors. You see how it's listed. You have the Gillespie, comma, Paula. So if you notice, it's the last name and then the first name, comma, and Neil Lerner. In this case, Neil is the first name and then the last name. So there's a particular order even for listing two authors. So you need to check your sources, check your style guide to make sure you're following all those rules. And then the last one, 3 or more, you see the et al. In use. So that's something that's listed there to show that it's more than 2 authors. Okay, so there are periodicals, and that relates to magazines or newspapers. So here are a few examples. We can look at the first example, which is a print newspaper. So Brubaker, comma, Bill is the author. The title of this particular article, if you notice, is not italicized. Since it's an article, is a smaller work. So new health center targets countries, uninsured patients, period. And then you get into the periodical title, the Washington Post, that's the newspaper. And then you have the date of the issue and then the page, okay? All right, so we can move on. You can see these examples on the PowerPoint a little bit later at your own leisure. So there's also ways to actually cite electronic works. So in this case, you're still looking at the elements that are necessary to list for the works cited page, right? And again, not all sources will use all these particular elements or have all these particular elements. So let's look at the entire website citation. So you have the last name, Faluga, comma, Dino, period. And then you have the name of the website, Guide to a Literary and Critical Theory. And this is under Purdue University. You have the date published, and then you also have the website link, okay? And if you look at the online database, you see some of those information, the same types of information, the name, the title of the piece, title of the journal, volume, issue, date of publication, where it's found, and also the search engine ProQuest and the HTTPS, the DOI, which is the direct object identifier, URL, okay? Okay. All right, so let's go through some of these other common entries. Dictionary, and I will say this, with the 9th edition, they've actually hankered down on how you can present dictionaries. And all that means is they are asking for more information, but I'll get to that in the next slide, but they're asking for more information. I'm really quickly going to go through this. Let's say that you looked up the word content in the dictionary and you used the dictionary online. For this particular dictionary, you have the word content, comma. You also have this N. That N now represents noun, whether it was a noun, verb, adjective, you need to be clear on how the word is used. And you see a number with this dictionary entry. This is actually the order of the definition. So let's say it was the first definition you found for content that was listed in this, because you know dictionaries will list more than one dictionary. So that number 1 actually represents the order in which it was found. And the next one, you see the number 4 that represents which of the ordered definitions you used. And then you have Merriam-Webster, which is where the name of the dictionary, when it was published and where it's found in terms of the URL. So moving down, films, movies, they can also be cited. In this case, the name of the film, you put who directed the film, who distributed the film, and the year it was released. You have songs, and you also have podcasts that can be cited. A few more examples: blogs, Twitter posts, images, paintings, etc. So any source that you have, MLA, the 9th edition, presents examples and ways to format those particular sources. Does someone have a question for me? I think I see a raised hand.
Yes, ma'am. The previous slide, apologies, good afternoon, everybody.
That's
On the
okay.
previous slide, right, with the website or the articles from the database, just for confirmation, it still will be in blue, right?
No, not in blue. Well, I'm not sure who said to present in blue. Blue is a default that certain applications, like let's say Microsoft Word, they put there. And if you notice, if it's in blue, it's most likely underlined. In some cases, it depends on the version of the application that you're using. But you want to just present all that information. It doesn't have to be in blue. It doesn't have to be underlined. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So students, so MLA came out with the 9th edition. I kind of wanted to just highlight the top 5 notable changes. And I will be honest with you, and I think I mentioned it early in the presentation, there aren't many changes at all. What the 9th edition does is actually provide more examples for persons to use. The 8th edition didn't have too much detail, didn't have an array of examples, and didn't spend a lot of time talking about grammar, punctuation, and different things of that sort. So the 9th edition is essentially the same thing, very few updates. But if I were to purchase the 8th or 9th edition in terms of the book, it would definitely be the 9th, not just because it's updated, but because it actually provides more examples that will guide students on what to use. But in terms of changes, there are some that are somewhat notable, I would say, because some of these are things that you probably may not interface with. So one of the changes, and this is in no particular order to say that one change is greater than the others, but the access date. And again, the access date is something that you really list at the end in terms of the works cited page, that last element for in terms of information for your sources. This is something often associated with websites, but only list this particular element if the publication date is not available. For in most cases, your publication date will be available, okay? So if the publication date is not available, then use the access date. But otherwise, you probably will interact or use the access date really much, okay? Another change, there is more emphasis placed on containers and more emphasis placed on details. With the 9th edition, they're very particular. Let's say that you watched a movie on the Netflix app versus, let's say the movie is the last one that came out, what, the Batman, right? It's just a particular movie, but the container you use to watch it, MLA is actually concerned with knowing. So they want to know, did you watch it via an app? Did you see it on a website? Et cetera, et cetera. Also, in terms of details, I think one of the most prominent one in terms of what's presented and having more specific information attached to that work citation, right? The final citation is the dictionary entry, where as now versus before, you need to provide what part of speech it is. You also need to state what order the definition came in, with number, in fact. With MLA 9th edition, there's also an expectation to use more inclusive language, but I believe that that was something already sort of broached upon in the 8th edition. But more inclusive language is encouraged. And I have an example here. They're preferring persons to use he, she, to use they instead of he, she, just to be more inclusive. Okay, and that's simply the guidelines for MLA. The fourth change, they've softened the rules on using URLs. Now, there were times students had to copy and paste the whole URL, and the URL maybe took up half a page. So what they're saying in the 9th edition is that you can reduce or abbreviate that URL or shorten it, but do it in a way so that the site is still traceable. So maybe it's, placing the main website and maybe there are a few phrases after it versus having lines and lines of that information. So they're giving some leeway to do that. Some professors may request for the full URL. And that is up to that professor. So it's always good to find out what edition the professor's interested in and if they're requesting any specifics. And the last update, in the 8th edition, MLA did away with the HTTP // but in the 9th edition, they brought it back. That is because some websites cannot function without the HTTP. So for the ones that can, because if you do certain searches, you'll see some websites still have this HTTP and some actually can function without it. So you can determine, typically when you're presenting the DOI links for those online journals, you want to include this HTTP, okay? All right, and that is basically it for the presentation. What I want to do is just direct your attention to some more resources. Not sure if you would have the opportunity to get the 9th edition, but if you can, it would be good to have the MLA book on hand. I know we usually keep it at the center, but we haven't been on campus due to the COVID protocols and so forth. So hopefully we'll be back up and running here by the fall, okay? There's also the MLA Style Center that you can find online, and I provided the URL for that. Purdue OWL is another source that students use. It's very well known. Purdue OWL University has a whole department dedicated to helping and assisting students with grammar, punctuation, with citations and so forth. So you can find MLA 9th edition information on there. I also want to state though, Purdue OWL isn't the only place that has the information. So there are some other universities that have library pages that you can find that information. The 9th edition, Columbia College, which you'll see in the 4th point, That's one college that has a great library guide, and MLA is already on there, because some universities pages you go to their library guides and they don't have it updated yet. And I'll also mention that there are some dedicated YouTube channels that give information about MLA, or perhaps certain types of citations as it relates to the 9th edition and so forth. Okay. Now I want to open it up. Okay, I see some persons asking questions if the recording will be available. Yes, it will be available. I can also plan to email this PowerPoint to students. Thank you, Mrs. Bain, for responding, so that they have that information. Any last questions that students want to pose? Go ahead, Serenity.
When I'm referencing a book, do I have to note if I have it digitally or in print?
No, that was a part of an old edition. You don't have to do that anymore, okay? Okay.
I just to know the information you'll be emailing, would that include the information for how to cite the interview and other things?
Yeah, I can include the interview and then also survey. So those were the two that came up, so I can include that information, okay?
Thank you.
No problem. Well, students, here ends the MLA presentation. What I would like for you guys to do, if you could maybe send the University Writing Center, because we actually put on the workshop, send us an email, just let us know if the presentation was insightful, if it was impactful. That's our email address right here on this slide, ubwritingcenter@gmail.com. And for those who are unaware of the University Writing Center, we have a Facebook